Hello and welcome to Learning Rewired, the podcast brought to you by Headspring, the joint venture between the Financial Times and IE Business School. I'm Thiago Kivi, and today my guest is Dr. Guy Champniss. Guy is a behavior scientist, author, and expert in applying behavior science to business challenges. He's also an associate professor here at Headspring, working directly with our clients in many complex projects, and also associate professor at IE Business School. Thanks for being here today, Guy. I wanted to jump in straight away and ask a little bit how you ended up becoming an expert in behavior science.
First of all, thank you for having me. It's very good to be here. I don't think I'm an expert. I hate the word expert. I think I'm a specialist in it. But how did I end up there? Well, it's a slightly convoluted story. After my MBA, I went to work for one of the big marketing services groups. And I was looking after their sort of insights work. And we were at the time looking a lot at what does sustainability mean for consumers? In other words, should brands, should advertisers be talking about it? And this is got a good few years ago. And we sort of explored that, and I didn't feel the answers were very good. I think they're a little bit thin. And I think, looking back with the benefit of hindsight, the problem I had with it was we just talked about attitudes all the time. What do people think? What do they think and what do they feel? And at the time I had this sort of nagging sense, well, actually that's not enough. There's more to this than that, because we know that, for example, with sustainability, classically, about 70% of us always say we really care about this stuff, but only about 20% of us do anything. So there's something else in the equation. And so I was lucky to go off to Stanford for a program, and I thought this was fantastic. It was like Disneyland for grown-ups. And that sort of set me on my path to commit myself properly to understand actually what does drive behavior. So I did my PhD. It was around about the same time as Nudge, the book came out, which lots of people were very interested in, including the UK and the US governments, the administrations at the time. And that's how I got into it, really. I just felt that there was another set of things to look at that can help us understand what drives behavior. It's not just what we think and what we feel. There's other stuff in there too. And that's what set me off on that journey. But many years later, it brings me here. Yeah.
Did you figure out what is that in between attitude and behavior?
Well, I'm not sure I figured it out, but I certainly read other people. So there's lots of things in there. I think the one thing that we often don't think about as much as we should do is just how much the social context influences what we think, the decisions we make, and the behaviors we engage in. And that's important because that social context changes all the time. From work, home, and everything in between, those social environments are very, very different each time. So a lot of what people say is, well, individuals are very inconsistent or unreliable. I'd say, well, no, we're not. We're just much more attuned to the changing social environment that we find ourselves in than most market research would like to admit. It makes it messier. It makes it more accurate, but it makes it a lot messier in terms of understanding how things happen.
So am I correct to assume then, so what holds a person back from supporting, let's say, environmental causes to acting on it is what? Social fabric? No,
mixture of things, potentially. It could be, if I say, hey, Tiago, I want to talk to you about how much do you care about the environment? Well, you know exactly what we're going to talk about now. So your beliefs, your attitudes towards the environment are suddenly switched on, because you're thinking, well, what do I think about this? What do I feel about these things? And most people, understandably, feel constructively towards these things. It does. I don't want to see environmental damage. I don't want to see all these issues, etc. The problem with attitudes, though, is they only work if they're switched on. And most of the time, when you and I are in the supermarket or at home, the attitudes that are sort of relevant at that moment in time are far more related to exactly what we're doing. So if we're thinking about trying to make supper for the family, for example, it's unlikely that your attitudes about those big conceptual issues are going to be switched on. Attitudes are vying for, there's a competition all the time. We can only think about so many things in one particular moment in time. So one of the challenges with it is that it's not so, the social context is relevant in that it determines which attitudes are turned on, which are activated. And if they're not activated, most attitudes have no influence over us. And that explains to a large part why we see this big, what they call the attitude behavior gap around sustainability or environmentalism, for example. It's not that people don't actually really care, it's that other things get in the way.
I get it. Yeah, very, very interesting. So, I mean, I know we talked already a lot about behavioral science, but I think it's very, very important that we put the right context into this conversation before jumping in deeply into the subject. And personally, I find the subject very interesting. I come from also a marketing background, so to me, I find that very interesting. And as in how consumer behaviors, what lead them to buy something, what makes a person prefer a product over another, etc. But I'm very curious to know from you how you help your clients with normally, when a client comes to a problem, what kind of problem are they trying to solve when they give you a call?
So it's a great question. And one of the challenges is translating whatever that problem is into a behavioral problem. And that is normally the case. Most challenges that organizations face, at their sort of root, they are a behavioral problem. You might want customers to behave differently towards your product, so they choose your product over a competitor's. You may want them to advocate for your product over someone else's. You might want your employees to do something differently in the business. Quite often those behaviors present themselves as an outcome that a client wants. Yeah, we want our employees to whatever that outcome may be. So part of the challenge is saying, well, we need to sort of decode that into, so what behaviors do we need to see happening? And a behavior is, very simply, if I take my phone out of my pocket, if it's a behavior, I can record it. I can see it happening. I can see someone doing something. So behaviors are great in that respect, because you can say, well, as soon as we can sort of reduce or distill this problem down into a series of behaviors that we say, okay, if people do these behaviors, we are going to deliver that outcome for you. And quite crucially, if we don't deliver those behaviors, the outcome's we're not going to get there. So that's part of the challenge in a way. So clients very rarely come to you and say, we've got a behavior problem. They say, we might have a transformation issue. We might have a change management issue. But typically, there are exceptions, but typically clients are not talking in the language of there's a behavior change issue. We've got some persistent behaviors that are getting in the way, or we've got some new behaviors that we're not seeing yet. That's an unusual conversation to have. Some clients do come up and say, we've narrowed it down to this needs to happen. But most of the time you're saying, and I suppose the point of differentiation would be, well, if you want your change initiative to work, for example, with employees, let's have a think about what do you want to see your employees doing differently. If you walked into the office tomorrow morning, what could you record on your phone that tells you this has worked? And that's, it's a little bit, there's a bit of discipline involved there, because people tend to sort of confuse behaviors with aspirations. I want all my employees to be happy. Well, that's not really a behavior. That's a perfectly good aspiration, but what might that look like? And then part of that challenge is saying, so how do we see that? What behaviors are we going to see on a daily basis that tells us, yes, okay, your employees are happy? What are the things we can measure? So working with clients, it varies. But the great thing about behavioral science, is it applies to everything. So if you're talking to, you're looking at customers, maybe B2B customers, why do customers not do something? Why may they not use a feature on your product or your service? That's a behavioral issue. You can look at consumers in terms of, why are they all saying that they want to buy a product, but they're not? That's a behavioral issue again. With employees, again, if it's a change management or any sort of initiative within the business which is involving a certain amount of sort of restructuring or reordering, that's a behavioral issue. One of the areas right now where behavioral science is important, but it doesn't get sort of center stage, is around things like AI adoption. Okay, there's a huge behavioural component to them. I mean, is that conversation being had? Not as much as conversations around the technology, around the efficiency gains, around the performance gains. There's not so much of a conversation around, well, what does it mean behaviourally for the people that work in your business? So in most cases, to answer your question as briefly as I can, clients very rarely come to you and say, we've got a behavioural problem. But in that initial conversation, you can get to a point of saying, there is a behaviour or a set of behaviours in here that if we don't address those, you might have some success, but it's going to be limited, or it might be quite brittle. It might sort of break quite soon after you've done it. What we really want to do is understand what's driving or stopping the behaviours that give this thing momentum. And if we can do that, then you take the handbrake off the thing you're trying to do. It works far more effectively. And in that process, behavioural science becomes the how rather than the what. This is how we can do it more effectively. But there is the challenge there that you have to sort of work out, well, how do we take this thing that you want to happen? How do we understand, well, what are the behaviours that are in service to that thing? And also at the moment, what's getting in the way of that thing? And so and that's how we sort of work through the process.
And then looking into this from a management perspective or from a leadership perspective, many of our clients come to Headspring asking as an outcome of our program, asking to see behavior change in the organization, right? And that's often, as you said, sometimes difficult to measure, or maybe not. Maybe I'm wrong here from your expression. I don't know, but I'd like to know actually, what does the science say about changing behavior? How do we actually lead a person to change behavior? What are the factors here that you need to push or not push? I don't know. In order to achieve that behavior change that many organizations want to achieve, especially when it comes to things like AI or adoption of change or adoption of a more innovation mindset. So how does behavior change?
So the good news is actually it's regardless of whichever context you're in, it's actually, I'm not saying it's straightforward, but there are clear patterns. And there are some frameworks that help us sort of organize our thinking around this. One of the most popular would straight away constructively challenge this idea that actually when a lot of companies say, I want to see change in the organization, it's a capability thing, isn't it? I just need to train my people to learn how to do this. From a behavioral science point of view, we say, well, actually, yes, capability might be a factor that is stopping this happening. So people may not have the skills, but there may be other factors as well. So equally important is this idea of, well, have you actually stopped to think in the organization, do people have the opportunity to engage in what you're asking them to do? Now, that opportunity could be physical in terms of, do they have the time? Do they have the resources to do this? But also there's what we call social opportunity. In other words, does the culture of the business, does the leadership of the business, do they look as if they're going to endorse this thing you want people to do? If you sense, and obviously perception is really important here, if your team, if your employees think, well, you're asking me to do this thing, but I just get a sense that management, my the leadership team, my management is not really on board with it, that will stop it happening. And that's not a question of capabilities. That individual might have the skills to do it, but they're just reading that the social, in this case, the social environment is that this is something that's not to be done yet, for example. The other big factor that is, more important potentially than this idea of do people have the skills to do it, is actually, are they motivated to do it? Motivation is the engine of behavior. And lots of training will look at capability building. And it's sort of implied in there that if you make people able to do something, they're going to be motivated to do it. That is true to a certain extent, but there's a whole bunch of other stuff that comes into that motivation piece that is not coming from having the skills to do it. So yes, if I know I can do it, I'm more likely to be motivated because I think, well, I'm not going to fail at this. If my manager is endorsing it in some way, sort of social opportunity piece, yes, my motivation may go up a bit. But motivation comes from lots of other places as well. So what do I actually think about the thing the company's asking me to do? Do I think it makes sense? Do I think it constructively, does it support the strategy of the business? If it doesn't, if I don't think it does, that's something we call reflective motivation. And I'm going to be saying, actually, I'm not that motivated to do it. I've got the skills, yes. My boss is doing it, fine. But actually, I don't think this is not going to help the business. It's not going to help me as an individual. And there's another pocket of motivation, which we call automatic motivation, which is things like impulse. So fear, worry, habit sits in there. I'm not going to do it because I've just always done it another way. Now, those all feed into our motivation. A lot of those things are not necessarily looked at or challenged in more sort of conventional training programs. There is a sort of a logic in a lot of those programs that says, if we just teach people how to do this stuff, it will happen. But actually, there are these other bits in the equation, the behavior equation as well, such as do they have the opportunity, and have we looked enough at what their motivation is to do this?
So, I mean, it's been 10 minutes probably since we started this conversation, and I think I learned already something really interesting, which is, I even wrote down here, motivation is the engine of behavior. What is this equation of behavior? What else? You mentioned motivation, you mentioned opportunity.
Yeah.
What are the other factors that really influence behavior?
So what I've just done there is I've sort of cribbed a very well-established sort of behavioral model.
Okay.
And it's called the COM-B, so COM-B. And really what that model says is that behavior is a product of capability, opportunity, and motivation. So I need to be able to do it. I need to have the capability. So that's in most cases in organizations, that's to do with the skills. I need to understand what it is you're asking me to do. I need to know how the software works, for example. Yeah. And the opportunity bit, there are two bits to that. There's the physical opportunity. So do I have the time and the resources to do it? And do I have the social opportunity? Is this a welcomed, acceptable thing to do in the business? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Social opportunity is an interesting one because quite often, so I do quite a lot of work with sales teams, and you'll often get sort of, I don't want to sort of generalize too much here, but you might get younger sales team members who are really pro the change, but part of their social opportunity comes from seeing their more senior peers in their group doing it. So sometimes that social opportunity doesn't come from the formal structure. It comes from that sort of informal structure within the organization. If those people who are informally very influential, if they're not doing it, then that social opportunity is taken away slightly. So to answer the question, it's like capability, physical, but mainly psychological. It's opportunity, again, physical, but often social. And then the motivation piece, which is fed by those capability and opportunity bits a little bit. Lots of other stuff come into that. Mm-hmm. Am I frightened about doing this? Am I nervous that I will look stupid doing something for the first time? Am I just so ingrained in a particular pattern of how to do this thing? The habits are about 50% of our behaviors every day. And it's interesting because I can educate you to within an inch of your life about doing something differently. But if the thing I'm trying to influence is a habit, there's a good chance that all that education, all that capability building wouldn't work. Why? Because habits fire on context. You find yourself in a particular situation with a particular group of people doing a particular thing. Habit is what happens as a result of that. And your attitudes are not really active. This is what I do in this situation. Think about getting off the tube in the morning and there's a Pret or a Costa or a Starbucks somewhere near the tube station, the metro station. Most people walk in to get their coffee in the morning, not because they want a cup of coffee, it's because it's a habit.
Yeah.
And that habit started originally because they wanted a cup of coffee, but the habit forms because the pattern forms. It's a certain time in the morning, I'm coming up the stairs of the underground, coffee shop's opposite there. It's going to be between 7:30 and 7:55 in the morning, whatever it may be. There are all these factors that repeat and create this pattern, and the behavior happens because it's part of that pattern. Habits explain a huge proportion of what we do at work. If you think about all the sort of routines and processes that we spend a lot of time building in the workplace, they create patterns. Now, that's great because people do them automatically, but it does make it slightly harder then if you want to get people to do things differently, because you've actually got to disrupt the pattern as much as you've got to educate them about the new thing to do. Otherwise, the education doesn't get called on because here's the pattern. I know what I do in this situation. So, going back to your point at the beginning, what does that equation look like? It is a combination, or a very sort of a good example of this that contains most things is capability, opportunity, and motivation. But in that motivation pot, there's a whole bunch of stuff.
Exactly.
Habits are one of those things that are in.
Yeah, and it's very interesting because obviously if a company is looking for behavior change from their employees, for example, they can control the capability element, right? Through training, giving them the chances to learn new skills, etc. They can control up to a certain up to a certain level the opportunity, right, element, because they can give them software or the business opportunities to go and exercise their behavior. The motivation part of it is very much a bit of a question mark, right? Because you can control some of it. Maybe someone might be motivated by financial reward or promotion, or something like that. But not everything, right, within the motivation element.
Yes, I mean, you're right. I mean, you're absolutely right that the attention is often not on that bit, I think. But does it mean that we can't change it? No, we can. There's lots of things we typically don't do in organizations because we tend to think there's this very, what we call a normative belief in most businesses that actually if we just we get the right building blocks in place. So if you train people and maybe, as you say, we give them access to the tools, whatever, they'll go ahead and do it. That's quite a normative view. In other words, it's an idealized view of how we as creatures operate. The great thing about behavioral science is that we say, well, we don't operate like that, and we're not going to criticize anyone. It's just, most of the way we operate is it's been determined by evolution. So there's a good reason why it's there. There's a good reason why we don't concentrate a lot of the time because we're trying to save energy, for example. Behavioral science is much more pragmatic and says, right, okay, well, to your point, if you want to change the way people do something in an organization, yes, you're right. We have to basically make sure they've got the skills to do it. So that capability building piece is very important. We've got to give them access to the kit, the opportunity, as you mentioned. Maybe the social opportunity. We say, well, actually, we want managers to demonstrate this. We want to see them doing it all the time. And maybe even better, see them failing now and again, because that's really good in terms of making people think, okay, if they can't do it perfectly, I'm going to give this a go. That increases my motivation to do it. But we can also play a lot of this in the motivation box. We can, for example, try and change people's beliefs about the thing we're trying to get them to do. We can maybe make a better story about how important this is to the success of the business. You just mentioned there are things like, for example, it'll be good for you, for your career. That's a great motivator. And we can try and switch off maybe some of those conflicting automatic motivations. So fear, concern, a sense of vulnerability, change. We just don't like it, most of us. And it's for good reason we don't like it, because it involves effort. And effort is something we do try and avoid. It's not that we're lazy. We're just trying to preserve energy. And in terms of habits, yes, we can change habits. We can disrupt habits. You can break them. One of the great examples is, as we seem to have most of the time in the UK, we have, in London, we have tube strikes, strikes on the underground. A strike is a huge bit of friction that basically disrupts very pattern behavior, commuting behavior. And when there were some strikes about 10 years ago, the strikes acted as the friction. The friction broke the pattern. People then had to reassess, well, what's the best way for me to get to work? And they suddenly discovered that they could walk, take a bike, possibly not even go to work at all. They could work from home. There were all these different ways they could deliver, or they could meet their goal. But it took a strike for them to realize that, because the strike broke the habit. It disrupted the pattern in that particular moment. And we can do that. We don't have to do it quite as aggressively in organizations. You can introduce lots of little changes in the environment that act as friction, and that friction then can break the habit. And once the habit's broken, at that point, suddenly your attitudes become relevant again.
Yeah.
And if we've done a job of basically trying to educate the individual about why this is worth doing, suddenly that now that becomes quite useful. It becomes quite influential.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit of it's more of an orchestra rather than one or two instruments. I think most training, capability building sees it as one or two instruments to play. I think what behavioural science says is, I mix my metaphors terribly here. There's no silver bullet, but there is silver buckshot. There are lots of things we can do at the same time. And there are projects I've worked on where we said, right, we're going to re-educate people, but we're going to change things in their physical environment to make it easier for them to do it, or to slightly disrupt what they used to do. There's a combination of those things. You build a little sort of a palette of tools, and that's, I think, I've never seen a situation where that is not the most effective way to get the behavior change. There is no silver bullet.
There's no silver bullet, yeah. And I mean, you were mentioning also the example of strikes and creating friction. One way sometimes that personally I've managed to achieve behavior change, like of a team, for example, was actually to incorporate the change as part of their habit instead of creating friction, but kind of, a little tweak in something that you already do.
Yep.
And then you create a new habit, for example, a change, I want to capture more data, more commercial data, for example, right? And I know the commercial team, they always log this information on the CRM, etc. So as part of that process, I add one little tweak that they have to do it, and then I have the information and then end up enriching and having more information about our customers, etc. Is there another way of looking to this as well? Am I correct to assume there are multiple ways to looking?
Absolutely. Yeah. And what you described there is something that gets called like a piggybacking effect. Yeah. So you say, well, actually, I want a new behavior. So can I just basically have it piggyback an existing one? Yeah. That's a very, very valid strategy.
Yeah.
Especially if the existing behavior is already constructive, is already beneficial. I just add something on. Now, chances are to do that, you made some tiny tweak in their environment. So maybe you put an extra question on a checklist or an extra point, or you had some sort of prompt that said, before you finish this task, do one more thing. Yeah. So that's a little change in the environment. Yeah. We sometimes call it environmental restructuring, and it can be really subtle, really subtle. I mean, we've done sort of environmental restructuring where we've just changed something in people's email signature. And we did that because we wanted to get a message to people. So the project was around corporate travel, and the client was a procurement department of a global healthcare company. And they noticed during lockdown that obviously travel had fallen to the floor, and they were pretty confident within the business that there hadn't been nearly as significant an impact commercially as they'd expected in terms of client relationships. So they said, can we try and we don't want to have it at zero, but can we try and suppress corporate travel? Because maybe it's not delivering, it's not as important as maybe we thought it was. But we don't want to tell people to stop traveling. That'll feel too heavy-handed. Can we use behavioural science to do this? And we sort of looked around to sort of see, well, do people, are we trying to stop a behaviour that everyone wants to do all the time? Is their motivation to travel really strong? And we found that actually it wasn't. One of the major drivers of their travel behaviour was sort of social acceptance in the business. I travel, therefore I am. If I'm not on the plane, I'm not going to meetings all over the world, I'm not very important. So that was really interesting to find that out, because it wasn't they wanted to do it for the sake of going to the meeting. They were doing it for sort of impressions management reasons. The motivation was slightly different. And we also found out, they said, but I can't say no to someone if they invite me. It was a very conservative Swiss pharmaceutical company, very conservative in their sort of culture. If you invite me to a meeting and I say, sorry, Tiago, no, I'm not going to come, that just looks rude. They couldn't do that. So he said, well, actually, we've got these two bits here which are quite interesting. One is we know they don't always want to travel. They feel as if they need to. And also they don't feel they can say no after getting an invitation. So we changed their email signatures to allow them to signal to anyone that writes to them they prefer not to travel unless it's for a particular type of meeting. Right. So this allowed them to say no before they got asked.
Right.
So we changed the order a bit slightly. And that was just a tiny bit of what we call environmental restructuring. How can we allow you to say to me before I invite you to a meeting, ideally you prefer not to travel? And there are lots of reasons why that may be. It's very inefficient, it's very expensive, there are some environmental costs, things like that. So you're right. These very tiny tweaks can be hugely influential. And again, behavioral science is very pragmatic. If you can say to a client, you don't need a big training program, you just need to change the environment slightly, then behavioral science, other people don't like it, commercial teams don't like it, but behavioral scientists would say, well, actually, that's a more elegant solution than lots of moving pieces and a really expensive, complicated training program. We can get the results by a tiny change. And I think that pragmatism is really valuable. I say commercially, it can upset people now and again to say, so we're not recommending the most expensive option. No, we're not recommending those. We're recommending the one that's most likely to work. There are issues with that because obviously those tiny changes can break very easily.
Yeah,
they can just snap after a month or something. So there is probably more to it than that. But yes, really those tiny changes, like piggybacking as you described just then.
Yeah,
if that does it, that's great. I mean, you have to look for unintended consequences. So, for example, do people shortcut other parts of the process to now do that bit at the end? Do people then, for example, start changing the data because now they know the data is going to be looked at in a different way? Those are all sort of repercussions or knock-on effects that we might look at to say, okay, can we second guess? Can we predict that people's behavior might change now those data are being looked at in a different way?
Yeah.
And so we explore around that side because we know that actually those things happen as well.
And just in this experiment, did the company actually notice a big change?
Well, I'm glad you asked because they did. They're in the band of travel that we were focusing on. And remember, we didn't say to anyone you can't travel anymore. We just gave them the better tools to make a better decision. So the client originally said, "Can we reduce travel?" And they were thinking along the lines of, do we change our travel policy? So do we take away the choice? And we said, let's not take away the choice. Let's help them make a better choice.
Mm.
So we enabled them to communicate. They didn't like traveling very often. We gave them a little tool that they could work out. It was a little mnemonic that you could work out and say, well, actually, does this meeting fit this mnemonic? If it does, I don't need to travel. And the great thing about that is we designed it quite nicely. Everyone knew the mnemonic. So there was no sort of, well, have you seen this thing that says that we should do it, including leadership? So they're within the tier of the organization that we were focusing on, in the first year of implementation, we reduced their travel costs by 52%.
Oh, wow.
And at no time did we say to people, you can't travel. And actually, when you look at the feedback from it as well, people were appreciative of the initiative because it allowed them and enabled them to make better choices. We weren't saying you can't do that, you've got to do something else. We were in a way allowing them to work out the best way to do it. And that's often the best way to do it. I mean, there will sometimes be behaviors which you just say that we can't have this anymore, how do we stop it? But in this particular case, a slightly lighter touch, a slightly more, just fiddling with the code, the tiny tweaks in a line of code here and there psychologically was enough to deliver them substantial saving.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, there's this idea of piggybacking. I'm not sure if it's the correct term or not, but piggybacking habits reminds me of that book, Atomic Habits, where he talks. I think James Clear, right, the author, he talks about habit stacking. If I'm correcting, is that the same idea, the same concept? Is that book even also based on?
Yes, so habits are interesting because 10, 15 years ago, they were the real sort of poor relation in psychology. As a type of behavior, they didn't really get that much attention. And there's a Canadian academic called Wendy Wood, and she really is she is the rock star academic now of habits. She pretty single-handedly drove research into habits. And her argument was compelling. She said, firstly, we should do this because habits are getting on for 50% of what we do every day. So if we don't understand them, any sort of behavior change, if that behavior change masquerades as change management, employee engagement, consumer behavior, buying behavior change, if we don't look at habits, we've got a 50% chance of having something work, and that's pretty low, And the second reason she said habits are very important is because they work like no other behavior. Every other behavior is what we call a goal-directed behavior. And so there is some we've got some idea of what we want to achieve. We have a goal, and then we might be wrong a lot of the time, but we then say, well, actually, will this behavior help me meet my goal? And that goal might be promotion. It might be about me looking good in front of my boss. It might be about satisfying hunger, whatever it may be. And she said, habits don't work like that. Habits just work on this pattern. If I get myself into this patterned environment, this is what happens at that particular moment. So she sort of championed all that work around habits. And habit stacking is something very, very similar to the idea of piggybacking. A good example, you probably, like most people, have your fire alarms, your smoke detectors in your house, and they're battery powered. Mm-hmm. And one of the challenges is people have them fitted, and they see them in the hallway, in the kitchen, whatever, and they forget to change the batteries. Mm-hmm. And eventually, this thing will squawk, when the battery's low. But if you go past the squawking phase, it just dies. Yeah. And so this is a completely redundant thing. The London Fire Brigade wants to try and get people to change their batteries, try to educate people about the importance of, if you don't have a working smoke alarm, didn't really work. So they did a habit stacking strategy instead. Mm. And they said, well, we want people to change these batteries twice a year, once every 6 months. What do people do anyway once every 6 months? And they really do it in the house because it's really inconvenient. You put the clocks forward or back by an hour in the spring and the autumn. So their campaign instead, was rather than sort of trying to just purely educate around the importance of doing it, they said, let's just attach our battery changing behavior to the clock changing behavior. And they ran a very, very compelling campaign that actually involved a clock on a fireplace mantelpiece. And actually in the ad, the clock melts because you forgot to change the battery on your smoke detector because the fire got over control. But it was quite a sophisticated approach to say, well, actually the easiest way to get this new behavior is to get into the slipstream of an existing behavior that we know everyone does, because it's so annoying if you don't change the clock on your cooker, or whatever it may be. So yes, there are, and again, it's one of those, it's a practical way of doing it. Yeah. Most traditional communicators would say, well, let's just educate people to the point that they realize how important it is. But we know that doesn't work.
And I think this is, really, really interesting. And I learned already a lot in this conversation, and particularly when it comes to the equation of behavior. And we see behavior science as a very interesting subject. Personally, what are you telling me? Super interesting. But it's not a topic that we often see, for example, in the curriculum of MBAs, right? This is something that is, rarely discussed in the business environment per se. And there are many leaders out there, senior executives, who might not be familiar, right, with behavior science. Alongside this COM-B framework, what are the other things that you think are quite essential, quite basic for leaders to know about behavior science?
Yeah, so I think it's a great shame that it's not more embedded in programs, because in things like MBAs, because obviously COM-B looks at behavior, so that's very good if you are thinking about employees or customers or consumers, or the market generally. There's decision making. So a huge chunk of so behavioral science is a catch-all term for lots of branches of psychology, maybe a bit of sociology and other bits thrown in there. People like Daniel Kahneman, won the Nobel Prize for economics as a psychologist, looking at decision-making styles and actually how we are very compromised a lot of the time in the quality of our decision-making. I would challenge you to find me any organization on the planet that doesn't think the quality of their leaders' decision-making is important to focus on. So, we know, for example, that we are, broadly speaking, we are quite cognitively lazy. Yeah, and that is true for the most senior of leaders in organizations. It's not a reflection of intelligence or education. It is just a sort of trained effect, because, our brain is about 2% of our body mass, and it consumes about a third of our energy every day. If that brain's working at full pelt, processing as much information as it can, trying to make those very deliberative calculations all the time, we'd all be finished by 10 o'clock in the morning. We'd be lying down. So the fact that we do take these shortcuts It's what Kahneman won his the Nobel Prize for, and this idea of heuristics, these mental shortcuts that we use to make decisions. If we didn't do those, we'd just be out of steam so quickly. But they can fundamentally mess up big decisions. So one of the classic ones is something called confirmation bias. So
Right.
confirmation bias describes it. I'll place far more emphasis on your opinion if it's the same as mine, and I'll look to try and diminish someone else's opinion if it disagrees with mine. Now, if I draw your attention to that as a leader, you'd say, well, I shouldn't do that because possibly that person over there's got a very good reason to be challenging it. But the key there is drawing attention to it. And drawing attention to anything requires effort. We do read effort as a cost, and we try and avoid those costs. Kahneman famously said, he said, thinking is to humans as swimming is to cats. They can do it, but they don't like it. And and it is true. And I think one of the most interesting things in sort of executive sort of leadership development environments is that people don't like to be told the fact that they use these mental shortcuts.
Right.
They think it somehow is synonymous with not being very clever. I think that's one of the most important things to stress, is it is absolutely not the case. If anything, it's the opposite. That in a lot of high performance roles, so for example, a surgeon, fighter pilot, firefighter, in those sort of roles, those heuristics, those learned shortcuts are incredibly important because they get the decision faster. If you're getting everyone to deliberate all the way through the process, it would be you wouldn't make the decision in time to start. I mean, famously, one military aircraft manufacturer at one point was experimenting with changing all the analog displays with digital displays, all the instrumentation. And they said, this is great because actually it's far less likely to fail and it's more accurate. If you're looking at a needle, well, is it 20 degrees or 25 degrees? But if you've got a number, you've got an absolute number. And the pilot said, we can't do it because you've taken away one of the most useful. We just use a visual check to make sure it's roughly where it should be. But now you're making me read every single number in the cockpit. Can't process it.
Yeah.
So there are, does that make them a bad pilot? No, it probably makes them a very good pilot because they know which of those decisions they can make sort of automatically. And at what point, if the needle gets to that point, then I need to focus on it. So, I think it's one of the most interesting things that behavioral science needs to do in businesses is to say, these heuristics, these little shortcuts that we use, these what might be compromises in our decision making, these are not signals or a display of failure. This is what we've evolved to be as a species. They are there for very good reason. The corporate world is a relatively new thing. There's a new environment for it to exist in. So there are some things we can do to basically safeguard against making compromise decisions in that respect.
And when do these shortcuts, when can they be unhelpful?
They can be unhelpful when, so for example, like confirmation bias, they can be unhelpful if we're not aware that we're using them for a start.
Right.
So, and it's very difficult. I mean, you can sit someone in a room for half a day and you can run through the top 10 biases that get in the way of executive decision making. And everyone goes, people will normally say, I can see that applying to other people that never applied to me. People always think that they're better than everyone else. But does that stop people doing them when they're out in the real world? No. Again, Kahneman's committed his entire working life to looking at these things. And he said, not long before he passed away, I cannot stop myself relying on these mechanisms. So it is very hard. And I think any training program that tells you it'll banish these biases is probably being a little bit, it's overstretching what it can do. You can definitely make people aware of them, and you can try and do things that when people are in meetings, you can have little sort of protocols, maybe just little internal protocols that may catch you being too reliant on, or basically not being attuned to one of these things playing out. But it's very difficult to stop them because they are a product of us trying to conserve energy. It's a relatively new thing that we find ourselves in such complex environments. The other way they can mess it up is people abuse them. So you'll quite often get environments that are designed specifically to have you use them to make a poor decision. And that's particularly the case in, well, it's another whole topic, social media.
Yeah.
The designers of social media are very, 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 very talented at using the design or including features in design that prey on those mental shortcuts that we use a lot.
Yeah.
Which is why we have lots of the challenges we have. So that's the we didn't evolve in what could be considered like a sort of malicious decision environment, but you can get malicious actors in those environments who can design the interactions, the environment in such a way that they know that they can use those. They know that we're using those to sort of try and make decisions, and they can basically adjust or manipulate the environment in such a way they get the results that they want, which aren't necessarily the results that we want as the person using it.
Very interesting. I'd love to know what happens in the brain when we're kind of making these short decisions. Is it a comfort kind of should put this question? Just trying to understand. Be really good to know what leads the brain to work this way. Is it like endorphin that we get, a boost of endorphin, or?
Well, so I'm not a sort of neuroscientist. I can't tell you exactly what happens with sort of the synapses and neurons and things, but we do know, for example, that another interesting area which talks to this is this idea of associations. It's called associative network theory, which is basically our memory daisy chains lots of things together. So if I said to you, for example, Italian red sports car, you'll almost certainly think of Ferrari. Yeah. Now that's a series of associations, okay? And that's one of the way these sort of shortcuts work, is that actually it's a bit like a large language. We have our own little sort of mini large language model in our head, but there are these sort of, the probability of saying Ferrari is being the right answer is higher. So those associations work, and this idea that actually if you sort of see those things over and over again, either in messaging or communications, or you actually see it going on, those associations form, and that becomes almost like the sort of the path of least resistance in terms of how we then think about those three words I said to you. So there is something that happens neurologically. That idea of what Kahneman called system. Well, he used the term. He didn't actually coin the term. System 1 and System 2 thinking. So fast and slow, as he described it. That's a bit of a sort of an artificial binary sort of view of it. It's not as if we've got one part of the brain that processes stuff superficially and another part that processes it more carefully. He said, actually, it's a good way to think about the fact that actually what happens is we shuttle backwards and forwards between those two processes. But the System 2, more deliberative processing, does consume a lot more energy. And so we are always trying to avoid. I mean, some would say one of the primary functions of our brain is it's an energy management system, because it knows that the rest of us has to be fueled as well. So it's a lot of the time making a judgment call. Maybe it's a little bit, probably stretching it, maybe it's a little bit, sort of ChatGPT 5, do you want me to think about this quickly, or do you want me to think about it more carefully? Yeah. And the brain will default to trying to do it more superficially.
Yeah. And aside to this, is there any other thing that you need to be aware of in terms of human behavior pattern that can affect decision?
I think the other one is the same. We mentioned at the beginning, the sort of social aspect.
Social aspect.
But again, we tend not to. It makes it messier, so it makes it harder to predict. Makes it harder to predict in things like focus groups and market research. I think is a huge factor as to why it gets ignored. But social environment, people that we're around, has a huge impact on the decisions we make and certainly the behaviors we engage in. There's a whole body of work around social norms, and those norms can be what we call descriptive norms that describe what other people do in a particular situation, and we are very, very influenced by seeing what other people like us do in a particular situation. But there are also things like injunctive norms that describes what we think other relevant people would like us to do in a situation. So a very good example of an injunctive norm is those speed cameras that rather than actually taking a photograph of you speeding, they flash up your speed and you either have a smiley face or a frowning sad face.
Yeah.
That's an injunctive norm. What that smiley face and frowning face is doing is telling you in that moment what other people think is good behavior. And if you get a sad face, all of society is saying to other you're engaging in bad behavior. Now, the interesting thing is those cameras are significantly more effective at getting people to slow down than cameras that take photographs. Well, so that sort of social influence, social pressure on you is hugely important. Now, that's a very obvious one, but in organizations, it's really, really important. Culture, an organizational culture, corporate culture, is a whole bag of social norms bundled up together. There are some things that would be frowned on in this organization. You just know that this wouldn't be the right thing to do.
Yeah.
And that is the right thing to do. So that's, but do we think about how important culture is in influencing decision-making? You might think that sometimes it curtails it. It makes it shorter because it's a very high-performance culture, whatever. But those sort of social influences are so much more nuanced. And as leaders, a big part of that individual's job is to build that social environment that is going to be conducive to the behaviors you want to see. So much leadership training focuses on the individual and takes them away from the very environment they have to operate in as a leader. It's a bit of an obvious statement, but if no one follows you, you are by definition not a leader. That sense of following could be quite subtle.
Yeah.
So a huge part of what it means to be a leader, I think, is around this sort of, how do I build that social context that my teams are going to be in? Might be the entire organization, might be 150,000 people worldwide. It's still a group. There is a group of people just here. Your role as a leader from a social psychology perspective is to become the prototypical member of that team. The absolute embodiment of what it means to be in that team. What does it represent? What does it stand for? Why is it better to be in this than to be out of it? The in-group and the out-group. There's some really basic structures just there. I'm sure there's some development programs that look at that, and there is a body of research in psychology that looks at this idea of what's called social identity theory, and that applied to leadership. But I often see that it's completely absent. But every organization is a group or a group of groups. So understanding how groups work for a leader should be top of the pile, I think.
So in essence, what you're saying is that a leader is a role model for good and for bad behavior, or for what is accepted as good or what is accepted as bad behavior.
Well, certainly for this idea of every group that we belong to has some identity attached.
Yeah.
And we are made up of what we call our self-concept. How we look at ourselves is a mixture of our personal identity, which might be some of our core values and beliefs that never change. But a big part of it is made up of social identities. So where you work, the culture of where you work, the role you have, the title you have, as a father or a mother, son, daughter, whatever, football supporter, Arsenal supporter, whatever it may be. All these groups that we belong to lots of groups. Every one of those groups has certain characteristics that define what it means to be in the group, certain behaviors, certain beliefs or attitudes. So a key part of when we join any group is that we sort of want to be the best person in the group. It's often described as the sort of the paradox in social psychology that on the one hand, we're really social creatures, so we want to fit in, but at the same time, we want to be slightly special in fitting in. So we want to be just a little bit individual in that sort of collective sense. And when we join groups, we want to be right in the middle of the group. We want to try and be the best person in that group. Leaders should be that individual. They should absolutely represent what it means to be a member of that group. If you don't, and that plays out outside of psychology, when you see people say, well, the leaders are not demonstrating, they're not being the person that they want everyone else in the organization to be, which sounds really obvious when you put it like that, but the psychology of it is very, very clear. That leaders should define what the group stands for. In other words, what is it that we do as a group? So what are the behaviors? What are the attitudes to a certain extent we want to see in the group? The leader needs to make that group feel distinctive compared to everyone else outside. So why does it matter that you work here? Why does it matter that this team, this project team, this department, this organization is important in some way? The leader needs to then represent that themselves, and the leader needs to constantly keep the group relevant. And that means, for example, what does it mean? So what does it mean to work for Headspring in relation to working with other business schools? So not IE. That's a slightly different need to define what it means to be in this group as it is to say, well, Headspring versus other executive development providers. So part of the role of the leader is to make sure that those who are in the group still feel that they are relevant and in some way better than all those other groups. And those other groups are really diverse because your competitors, it's a very complicated way to sort of work that out. But a key part of leadership is to keep people feeling that they are special within that group. And again, there are various ways that can be done, but I often don't see that being talked about maybe as frequently as I think it should be when it comes to what does good leadership look like.
Sure. And what are you saying? Does that connect a little bit with purpose?
Yes, well, purpose, I mean, there's purpose with a capital P and purpose with a small p. Purpose with a big P is often the sort of what's the role of the business beyond the business. Purpose with a small p is, yes, why do we exist? And that is a key part of it. Work is a huge part of our lives now, rightly or wrongly. If you don't have that purpose, it is hard work. It is really, really hard work. Trust is a huge part of that as well. We force everyone in organizations now to a level of collaboration where there has to be high levels of trust. Again, we know from psychology that if you are forced into a close social interaction and you don't trust the people you're doing it with, it is extraordinarily stressful. Trust is defined, psychology would just define trust as your belief that you're not going to come to physical or psychological harm.
Yeah.
Well, if you don't trust an environment, if you don't trust the organization, if you don't trust the people you're working with, in effect, you're putting yourself in harm's way all the time. That is a major driver of burnout and high attrition rates in organizations. High levels of collaboration, low levels of trust.
And I recall over the last few years, we've seen some major changes, particularly on the type of requests that we get from clients, right? And a few years ago, we're looking at a lot of programs related to purpose, sustainability, and so on. This year, 2025, we're looking more at performance. A lot of companies out there are looking at setting high-performance teams, ensuring that their teams are navigating change effectively, AI adoption and all of that. You mentioned purpose. It was very interesting. I'd like to dive a little bit into performance. How can behavior science really help leaders achieve the highest performance for with their teams?
So high-performing teams are well-functioning groups of people, essentially. And so social psychology in particular looks at group dynamics and what does it take to make those groups work well. So there's lots that can be looked at there. There's interesting work, for example, that explores the various actions that high-performing groups take. And I think there are three stages. There's setup actions, sort of those ongoing actions, and there's also what they call interpersonal actions. And the setup actions are all around how do you make sure you've got the right resources, you've got the right skills in the team, the right people. Are you clearly defining what it is you're going to be doing? Because how are we going to know if we've done it if we don't know what we're doing? Those sort of ongoing actions are all these are sort of ongoing calibration, recalibration. Do we now think we've got the right skills in the group? Did we misjudge what we needed at the beginning, and now we're actually doing it? We need to change it. And then the interpersonal ones, as the name suggests, are all it's monitoring and sort of maintaining the human interactions in terms of emotional responses to situations and stress and things like that. Groups that do those three things well are higher performing groups because they're managing themselves more effectively. One of the key things to understand about whether the group's going to do those things is, well, does the group believe in itself? Now, we mentioned about a key role of leadership is to try and say, yes, you should believe in yourselves as a group. But again, behavioral science, psychology, talks about something we call collective efficacy. Now, that's a slightly sort of obscure term that says, well, do I, as a member of the group, believe in how effective we can be as a group? Collective efficacy. Do I think we can do this? It's an extension of something called self-efficacy, which is a sort of a targeted version of self-confidence.
Mm-hmm.
If I have high self-efficacy in a particular task, I think, yeah, I can do this. I can do this, And we know that there are various things we can do, especially in sports psychology, for example, that are proven to increase your self-efficacy as an athlete. Sports coaches are very good at, taking all the noise out of the system and sort of focusing on the signal in terms of what do you need to do. We have a similar, but self-efficacy is just as important in organizations, but collective efficacy is that sort of thing applied to the group. Well, a key part of what a leader should be doing is increasing that sense of collective efficacy in the group. If you make the group feel as if they're more competent, they're more able, that they've got that right mix of skills, then those groups are more likely to engage in those group actions I described. And that leads to higher, better performance, higher effectiveness. So there are lots of bits that you can take to apply to these situations. One of the interesting sort of side effects of that sort of high performance, though, is there's a risk that you take away some of those key learning opportunities because it's all about the performance. And we know that actually we can learn a huge amount from failure. We learn more from failure than we learn from success. We tend to sort of misattribute where the success came from. When we look at failure, we are forensic in our trying to work out what went wrong. It's a huge shame that a lot of organizations don't give as much time to unpicking what led to the failure of a project. And it is a project. It shouldn't be the individuals who ran that project. Sometimes, maybe, but a lot of time it's the project. And I think that's one of the areas, that's one of the risks of that sort of high performance environment you're describing. It's there's no time, and maybe the culture doesn't give room to that little bit of post-match analysis in terms of
And I think inevitably, as we are in 2025, going almost to 2026, an inevitable topic is AI. I just wanted to touch very briefly, how do you see this whole revolution now in terms of the impact that it has on business, the impact that it has on people's behavior as well? Like how they even using their brains now? How are people rewiring their brains almost to incorporate AI into their work, into their day-to-day work? So, do you have any thoughts?
I have lots of
thoughts. I'd love to hear.
So I think it's still very early days, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, this thing has exploded over the last 3 years. I mean, it's in the mainstream. I think so. A couple of observations. Firstly, the conversation is being driven mainly by the companies that create it and consulting firms, which I think is only part of the story. And the conversation that they are driving is around, to your point just now, it's around efficiency and performance. That, I think there are two ways to respond to that. One is being quite pragmatic in terms of saying, well, actually, yes, performance and efficiency is everything. We can do more with less, which most businesses are very, very interested in. The slightly more philosophical academic discussion is around, well, are we sacrificing effectiveness for efficiency? I think that could be unpacked in lots of different ways. I think it plays up. That's a very clear conversation in, for example, business schools. How much should we be focused on the delivery of efficiency as a skill rather than sort of knowing how to be effective as a skill?
Yes.
I think that then goes into the main issue, is that there is a lot of evidence that there are some quite pernicious negative effects from the use of AI. So one is this idea of cognitive offloading, that we just think, well, actually, rather than trying to work it out, I'm just going to go straight to ChatGPT or whatever. Yeah. And that, to a certain extent, goes back to the point I was saying earlier about effort. Effort being seen as a cost. Suddenly, this technology takes away the effort. It basically takes away the cost.
Yeah.
That's compelling. It's like catnip to us. I can save energy doing this. So it's pushing on a wide open door in terms of human nature. But that cognitive offloading is a thing. It's well shown. There's something which is called the Google effect, which is actually, and this is an interesting response in terms of how our brains work.
Yeah.
If I know the information's out there, I don't need to remember the information.
Yeah.
I just need to remember where I go to get the information.
Yeah.
So actually, that idea of a well-honed prompt becomes the thing that I remember now, not what the prompt serves back, because I know that's always out there.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting case of actually where we're sort of adapting. So, well, where do I need to basically commit memory to? I need to remember where I need to go to get this stuff. So I need to remember the stuff I get. There's also quite interesting social consequences of it. That there's evidence that, so on one level, if you admit that you're using AI at work, if you're transparent about that, your peers think less of you. Even if your peers are also using it, your credibility goes down.
Yeah.
That's a huge risk to you in the workplace.
Yeah.
If your peers no longer think you're as good as you before you were yesterday. But also social interaction is going down. Levels of collaboration are going down because it's difficult for you and me to have a conversation because heaven forbid you might disagree with me. If I go on to use Gen AI, it's less likely to disagree with me. It's going to be a more efficient exchange. And that, in one conversation with one of the UK universities, the vice chancellor said they are seeing that now, that actually those smaller group exercises amongst their students are becoming harder to do. And this is, we're talking about a couple of years. It's how incredibly fast people are adapting. They just find it easier. That's a combination of easier and more efficient.
Yeah.
And maybe more emotionally, there's less risk attached to it. To interact solely with. So there are lots of factors here that are not, I don't think, are getting the airtime they need to get. And I think where that plays out is you see that actually there may be a compelling business case in terms of efficiency and performance to do this. Inevitably, the psychological consequences of it will play out. They're lagging indicators that will come through later on. People's sense of autonomy in the workplace, that's going to be eroded. People's sense of mastery or competence. I can do it better than I can. They're going to feel rubbish about themselves. That relatedness, that sense of being part of a community, that's being diminished. Your professional identity at work, that's being diminished because AI can do it better than you can. And that sense of credibility or sort of social standing, again, there's lots of factors there. And those first three, autonomy, competence and relatedness, those aren't new things that are coming about because of Gen AI. Those are what's called self-determination theory. They're factors in a well-established, incredibly well-established theory that says that these motivate us to do things. So if AI takes those things away, we're back to the engine of behavior again. Your motivation disappears. Businesses don't see that at the moment because they're fixated on the technology and the performance and efficiency gains. But I do think, I'd love to be wrong, but I do think there is a little bit of a horror story growing underneath all of this. And that is actually some very, very unhappy, unmotivated, demotivated employees. And that'll play out. You won't see that for a while just yet.
Yeah. Fascinating. I think we run out of time, unfortunately, because this is really, really interesting. Guy, I really want to thank you for your time, but I wanted to also ask you, what are you reading at the moment? What are you interested in at the moment? And what are you working on at the moment that is worth sharing here with our audience?
So in terms of reading, I am very boring because I just tend to read academic papers. It's not dull.
Come on.
It's a standing joke in our house. My wife says, I haven't read a novel for 20 years. I always say, if I've got time to read, I should read something. So I'm reading a lot around what we just discussed just there in terms of this sort of emerging psychology of AI literature. I think that's very interesting. I'm particularly interested in a lot of these sort of naysayers about AI. There's a small camp of people now who are almost become like sort of 21st century Luddites in terms of sort of trying to break the system, which I think is quite interesting. In terms of what I'm working on, well, again, A lot of it is how can we build better decision-making skills in organizations? So that doesn't go away. Organizational change, well, again, let's take your outcome you want and let's break it down to behaviors. That work doesn't seem to go away. But the area that's started to come through again is this idea. There are some companies now that are saying, do we need to think more carefully about what AI is doing to our employees in terms of and their roles? And that's that. My sense is that's going to build more and more. But that's an area of both real interest. Well, interest for me. But there are those companies now that are starting to say, is there something? Are there things that we don't know about? And I think that's inevitable because the technology is dominating the conversation. But I do think it's going to be the psychology of AI more than the technology of AI that's going to basically creep up the agenda for organizations in the next few years. We're starting to see the shoots of that coming through at the moment. And
for anyone who wants to connect with you, what is the best way?
So I'm on LinkedIn, and I sort of have a relationship with IE Business School and University, as you mentioned, so I can be contacted through there. And as a sort of consultant, I have my own little company called Meltwater Consulting. All of that sitting on LinkedIn. So LinkedIn is the best place to go, Guy Champniss,
Excellent. Thank you very much. My guest has been Dr. Guy Champniss. I've been Thiago Kivi. This has been Learning Rewired from Headspring. Look forward to our next conversation and see you next time. Thank you very much, Guy.
You're welcome. Thanks very much for the time.